we're speaking with economist Sriram Balasubramanian. Sriram is author of a number of books, among them The Wizards and Cautilionomics. Today we're discussing his latest book, now out in India and shortly in the United States, Dharmanomics. We discuss what makes Dharmic Capitalism different from other regional varieties of capitalism, how this economic outlook extends back millennia to the kingdoms and empires of southern India and Southeast Asia, the role of temples in economic activity, the economic effects of the Kumbh Mela, and more. Hope you enjoy it. So Sriram, let's jump right into it. What is Dharmanomics? And in your book, you call it Dharmic Capitalism. So what is that and how is that different from other economic theories, systems that fall into the broadly capitalist framework?
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for HAF for inviting me for this podcast. I've been grateful for their invitation and been an avid follower of some of your work. So good to be here. That's one of the questions that people often ask. I respond by mentioning about how I approach this research. There are two research questions which lead me to some of your answers. The first question is, what is the indigenous economic model that Bharat had for thousands of years? And what is the indigenous thrust for Viksit Bharat as well? And the second question is, what's the role of cultural norms, narratives, and its impact on economic decision making, both at the individual level and at the corporate and the policy level as well? I think these two questions, form the basis of a lot of my research. My previous book, Cautilionomics for Modern Times, deals with this idea of Dharmic Capitalism. Basically, I define dharma through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and harmony, engaging with the rest of the world. And these are mapped to concepts such as rule-based yet non-intrusive state, wealth creation via global outlook, and then sustainable growth and welfare. So this broadly forms what I call Dharmic Capitalism. And my view is that Kautilya, ancient thinker who's the author of the Arthashastra, had ideas related to this. So, and then in my previous book, I deal with a lot of the contemporary macro topics in India, like trade, inequality, labor contracts, and apply some of Kautilya's ideas. In this book, in Dharmanomics, which is a sequel to the previous one, I deal with the common era kingdoms, the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Kambojidesa and Cambodia, Vietnam, and Southeast Asian kingdoms, and argue that these dharma-based economic frameworks were there in various iterations during the early Common Era period. This includes Kautilya's Dharmic Capitalism, which I just briefly mentioned earlier, and then the idea of the Dharmic ecosystem, which is basically the temple-based economies. The role of the temple is not just a religious institution, but also the economies of scale that the temple economic ecosystem provides. And the Dharmic way of life provides. And lastly, on Shrinis, the corporate guilds, which were integral to ancient Bharat's prosperity, which drove a lot of these kingdoms. So these three are, main pillars of what I would call Dharmanomics. And in the broader context of, capitalism and the entire sort of, the Anglo-Saxon model of modern day capitalism, I would say that this is an alternative, which is based on a past which has been prosperous and which has endured for many years. And the role of dharma plays beyond the boundaries of the state and the market. The modern day economic frameworks talk about just a state, which is the state that imposes taxes, that stimulates the economy and things like that. And then you have the market, which promotes opportunity, promotes firms to grow and things like that. But beyond these two binaries, I argue that there is the idea of dharma, which could play a foundational role, addressing the issues of both the state and the market. If there is corruption in the state, a more dharmic society ensures that there's less propensity to be corrupt. Similarly, if there's moral hazard in the markets, a more sort of dharmic governance system ensures that moral hazard can be avoided as well. So in that sense, it is a sort of an extension, but a more inclusive, sustainable extension to the current prism. And lastly, to your question, I mean, most of the if you really look at the economic models of most superpowers or aspiring superpowers, they're all derived from their intrinsic past. So, for example, modern day capitalism that the United States has is an inspiration from the Protestant ethic. Similarly, the Chinese have their own indigenous models and cultural norms that drive their economic policy, similar for the Japanese as well. So a lot of these countries who aspire to be superpowers eventually look at their indigenous principles because they provide the platform. I think in the case of Bharat, this idea of dharma-based economic frameworks, I think, plays an important role in understanding this dharmic way of life and its impact on economic activity.
Let's go back to the beginning. You mentioned several what are now ancient kingdoms, regions of India, dynasties. Let's start there and provide the framework for people about how this dharmic way of looking at business, at capitalism, started playing out and developed.
Yeah. So if we look at the common era kingdoms, right? I mean, if we take the Cholas, the Pallavas, basically Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, and Vijayanagar Empire, these are all kingdoms in southern Bharat, which were, I would say, started off in the early common era period till about even 16th, 17th century CE in some cases. But predominantly these kingdoms were considered to be one of the most prosperous during those times. I mean, Angus Madison talks about, he was noted a late historian who produced this data series on GDP and GDP per capita in countries across the world over a period of 1,000 years. And India and China were the top two countries till about 17th century CE. So I was of the view that there had to be a philosophical foundation to this. And that's how this idea of dharma-based economic frameworks came through. So you see that even in some of these kingdoms. For example, the Cholas, they had extensive trade networks, maritime trade networks across Asia and the Middle East. So a lot of their ports, which is for example, in Nagapattinam, which is in Tamil Nadu, in a southern state in India, served as an important port, a transitory port, which would be some sort of a modern day Singapore, where it could transit a lot of the goods and services that came from Middle East, which were going towards China via Bharat. So they had a lot of these maritime networks, which were powering trade. Similarly, they had these guilds called Shrinis. There's a famous guild called Ainurvar, which is it's called 500 in Tamil. The guild was a large sort of multinational corporation of today. It had many offices in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, and Cambodia. And they were basically driving a lot of commerce and economic trade. So much so that they financed the Cholas quite a bit. And so much so that, Rajendra Chola, that is the son of Rajaraja Chola. So basically, Rajaraja Chola was this king who built this huge Brihadishwara temple, which is a famous temple in Tanjore, in Tamil Nadu, which is a UNESCO monument. And this huge temple was built by this king, who was a very famous king. His son was known to travel and conquer across the seas. So he traveled all the way to Southeast Asia and won battles there. But the Cholas did not rule these places in Southeast Asia. There's a particular reason, because one of the reasons why they had conquered is because this corporate guild, the Srini, which I mentioned, was being stifled by the Indonesian kings. At that time, it was called Srivijaya Kingdom. And to liberate these guilds, the Cholas combined with the Cambodian kings and liberated these guilds so that they can function properly. This is an important example because it tells you a few things. One, it tells you commerce was so-called globalization of what we call today in terms of international trade and commerce was also rampant during ancient Bharat. And it played a very important role, not just in the trade and finance, but also in the politics of that particular region and the extensive, Southern Asian and Asian region. And second, I mean, this idea of common people-to-people movement driving political alignments was also there, in the sense that a lot of common people, including traders, were ahead of the politicians in terms of traveling to all these places and then engaging in commercial activity, and the kings followed suit. So I think these are some examples. I mean, at least in the Cholas. Similarly, the Pallavas, for example, which is again another southern kingdom. As an example, they anointed a particular king in around 7th century CE, who was actually born in Champa in Vietnam. I mean, just imagine, right? The king is actually born in another place. So basically, what happened is there was a king who did not have progeny, so he passed away, and then he had an earlier generation of his own kith and kin who had migrated to Cambodia in around 6th, 7th century CE, and their lineage. One of the kings had 4 children. So the Pallavas went in search of their lineage, and then found and then offered the children the kingdom, and 3 of them rejected. But the 4th child, who was 11 years old, said yes, he would come and take over the reins. And he was 11-year-old Nandivarman too, and he built the Kanchipuram, or expanded the Kanchipuram Varadaraja Perumal temple, which is again a famous temple, and became one of the great Pallava rulers. What I'm trying to say is society was sort of egalitarian and open enough to anoint someone from the outside as their own, and society was fairly open-ended, and very sort of engaging with the rest of the world in terms of ideas and thought process. These are some examples of how these dharma-based economic frameworks came through. Of course, the temple-based economies, I can probably explain that in our subsequent question.
Sure, we can get onto that in one sec, but it's occurring to me that in all these kingdoms that you've named, they're all broadly southern India, extending into modern Southeast Asia. What's going on in the more northern areas of India at this time? I mean, is this something that is beyond the scope of what you've researched? Is there anything that we can learn, contrast, similarity, or have similarities there, or no?
Yeah, I mean, for the sake of the book and for what I've done, I've not covered the northern kingdoms. So I've predominantly stuck to the southern kingdoms, purely because, one, for the want of space and time, that's how much you can do in a particular book, especially in a commercial book, and also because the linkages that is drawn to Southeast Asia, especially because of trade and things like that, were far more aligned to the southern kingdoms. So in terms of the narrative, I think it helped to weave a more coherent narrative. But I'm pretty sure the northern kingdoms as well had some of these things. But of course, the entire Islamic invasions and the impact of such invasions in northern Bharat was far more intense. So the advantage that the southern kingdoms had was that they were subject to less of this. And they were able to retain a lot of the evidence, that we're seeing. Because see, what I also do is something called triangulation of evidence, right? Because we want to have a rigorous, one of the reasons I spend a lot of time on this is to have a rigorous analytical sort of approach to research. So I do what I call triangulation of research, which is, one, look at some data which is available. For example, Madison's data set is an example. But even within Madison's data set, I don't agree with some of the absolute numbers because they are thousands of years back. Even today, informal data is a bit challenging. But the trend lines are something that one needs to look out for because they compare using a common base. So the data is one important component. Two is a lot of these inscriptions. Because essentially inscriptions provide a lot of evidence because a lot of the southern kingdoms, they inscribed most of the things that were happening in their kingdoms. They were quite transparent. So you have a lot of these inscriptions which provide secondary evidence. And then what I call anecdotal evidence, right? Because it's important to know that parallelly, there are a lot of these travelers that were going into Bharat purely because it was such a prosperous place. You had Chinese travelers, you had Greek travelers, you had Portuguese, you had Israeli Jews who were all traveling either for trade or commerce or tourism or whatever it is. So these people had written a lot of anecdotal evidence. So if there is a sort of an idea or analysis that I bring in these books, I triangulate with all these three evidences so that there is a coherent argument and a sophisticated sort of argument. I think so. Answering your question, I think this doesn't cover the northern kingdoms for a variety of reasons, but the underlying principle of dharma-based ideas, I think, is a recurring theme across Bharat, irrespective of north or south, and it exists even today. In fact, one of the reasons my third part of the series of these books is to highlight how these frameworks apply to a current Bharat and Viksit Bharat. We're talking about the Mahakumbh today, where 400 million people are arriving at a particular city for 45 days. This is a classic case of this dharmic way of life exhibiting itself today. So what I'm trying to say is this entire way of life permeates across Bharat. And these based, and this drives economic outcomes and output, at least from an ancient Bharat's perspective.
We can get to the Kumbh Mela in a little bit, but I just want to use as the bridge history, the old history and current issues. You've mentioned Cambodia, and I was curious in your research, how did this economic model, as well as the Dharmic ideas behind it, start influencing the kingdom in Cambodia? Because you can't escape the fact that the largest religious building in the world started off as a Hindu monument, later Buddhist, in Angkor Wat. How did this, lay that out for people, how that transition happened and how that influence happened and how the economic models supported it?
Yeah, and in Cambodia is a very unique case, right? I call it the Kambuj Desa in this book. I mean, your listeners should read Kambuj Desa by R.C. Majumdar, who's a renowned historian and has written a brilliant book on how the entire Cambodian kingdoms came through. I think it's important. I mean, for those who travel, who have been to Angkor Wat, you would realize that as you travel, as you go through Siam Reap and all these places, you would find Shivlingas along the way. As you walk through many of these places, in isolation or in common groups. The entire Angkor Wat complex, though it's not a functioning temple, it's a marvel by itself. So I think it's important to understand some historical perspective. So the post-Funan period is when some of these kingdoms really gained traction. I'm talking about after 5th century CE. The time between 6th century CE till about 13th century CE, that's when the entire sort of Hindu, the Dharmic kingdoms took over, Cambodia. So much so that it's extensively a temple-based economic model. At least the Cholas and the Pallavas had the temple-based economies as a component of it. But in Cambodia, because of the fact that they're a bit landlocked and they have access to only one part of the sea, the temple-based economic model was foundational to their economic prosperity. So basically the origins of this is again an interesting take. One of the theories of the origin is that there was a Vedic Pandit from Kanjipuram and a trader as well named Kaudinya who had traveled to Cambodia. And then he falls in love with the local prince in Cambodia called Soma. And then they mate and the Hindu, the sort of Dharmic kingdom start from then on in Cambodia. This is one of the theories. Of course, there's one Khmer theory that is the Khmers from Assam and northeastern Bharat had also come through the land route into Cambodia, and their influences are also quite visible. So a lot of these kingdoms emanated from this time, and there are various theories to their source, which I detail in my book. And then during this period, so that's when the construction of all these temples happened. Not just in contemporary Cambodia. You see that even in Vietnam, for example. I mean, the entire belt of Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, bits of Malaysia, and also, Java, and the entire Southeast Asian belt had various iterations of this. They could be Buddhist kingdoms, they could be Hindu kingdoms, they could be a combination of both. And in a lot of these cases, you had these civilizations where these instruments such as these temples played one is the role of a temple as a religious institution. You go to a temple, you pray, you say, do archana, you donate to the temple and things like that. And the revenue the temple itself generates as a religious institution. And then there's the economies of scale beyond the temple, which means the kirana shops, the shops around the temple, the tourism that the temple generates, the infrastructure that the temple generates, the entire sort of temple economies of scale around the temple at the village level. Both in terms of agriculture as well as other areas, was used by these kings, especially in Cambodia, to sort of expand their economic potential and expand inclusive growth and things like that. So these were, I would say, for people who are visiting these places now, it's very important to sort of understand this. In fact, noted archaeologist Dr. Nagaswamy, who's no more now, used to tell me that, there used to be, in every village, there used to be a small Shiva temple at some point of time in Cambodia. Such is the extensive, sort of Dharmic kingdoms. And also it's interesting to note, a lot of the inscriptions, they're all in Prakrit or Sanskritam, for example. And they're all related to, they make a lot of connections to Bharatiya philosophy. For example, the Arthashastra finds a lot of mention in some of these inscriptions. And just to give you some context, right? The Arthashastra was discovered in India only in the 19th century, in modern India, when Shama Shastri translated it in 1915. It was supposed to have sort of disappeared out of publication for a long period of time. But yet, you find inscriptions in Cambodia, in Vietnam, which talk about the Arthashastra as sort of I would say, references to it and a sort of inspirational guide for their governance. Which means that the exchange of ideas was so rampant that people to people interactions sort of enabled a lot of these kingdoms to gain knowledge. And it's important to note, Bharat was seen as the most prosperous country during that time. So that's why its institutions, its values, its thought processes gained a lot of leverage, even in these countries, because they saw it as one of the right ways to do things. So you see a lot of this in Cambodia and Vietnam as well. And for example, extending a bit to Vietnam, just to conclude this part of my answer, you notice in the coast of Vietnam, there are cities called Panduranga, all these, Dharmic names. And there's, for example, a 7th century Shiva temple, which was recently discovered by ASI, which also played a role. And though Cambodia and Vietnam were sort of cat and mouse, because Vietnam had a beautiful coast which was leading to China for trade, and Cambodian kings tried to conquer it, and they had their own geopolitical dimensions, but the entire Dharmic undercurrent was a common denominator for a lot of these kingdoms. And I think that's a very important observation as well.
Let's jump forward then, in the interest of time. How is or is not modern India, particularly under recent governments, embodying this? What do you think they have taken from it or could take from it today?
Yeah, I think there are a few important things today that makes a lot of this discussion, these books, very relevant, right? The first thing, like I mentioned, right, the Dharmic way of life is intrinsic to Bharatiyas and Bharat as a whole, which means it influences a lot of people in their economic decision making. For example, if you look at the discretionary expenditure, which means non-essential expenditure, most of it is linked to the cultural way of life through the year. For example, the highest UPI transactions, digital transactions, happens during the week of Diwali, for example. So most of the cultural events like the Kumbh and things like that drive a lot of these discretionary economic choices. So today that is relevant. If you look at the corporate India, if you look at the top 15, 20 firms in India, most of them are family-driven firms. They might be publicly listed, but these are all firms, large firms, whether it's Mukesh Ambani or the Adanis or you take any major conglomerate. They're all driven by their choices, business decisions are driven by their own cultural norms and narratives. So I think in today's context, that's very, very important. And secondly, I think more important is the fact is the entire role of these temples and the role of temples in villages. The temple as an economic institution um, still remains one of the single biggest economic institutions in any village in Bharat. The ecosystem that the temple creates, the temple towns, for example, they drive a lot of commerce and economic activity. So in today's parlance, you find that the multidimensionality of the temple still remains. So, for example, the temple's ecosystem that it creates, it used to play four key roles in the past. One is it used to be labor aggregator, which means it provides employment based on the land and other things in the past. Two, it served as banks and financial institutions. The temples used to lend out money. That's why most of the temples around the coast in Bharat, the major temples, to a lot of these guilds, which I mentioned, and served as venture capital funds as well to provide entrepreneurs with money with a particular interest rate. And they used to serve as financial institutions. And lastly, they also were redistributive hubs, which means, they provided, for example, in the Vijayanagar temple, in the Tirumala temple in Tirupati, there are inscriptions that say that how institutionally the Vijayanagar Empire ensured that, a lot of money that flows from the rich through an endowment fund went to the poor because the temple used to provide free food for a lot of people, even below poverty line. So they used to have 3 times a day free food, which was mitigating poverty and things like that. So even today, the temple and its ecosystem plays a lot of important functions like this. Of course, they're not banks and financial institutions now, but other roles they play a very important role. At least the ecosystem that it develops. So I think in today's parlance, I think these are all important traits that you see. And the entire informal sector in India, which contributes to 70-80% of the population, they are driven by values like trust, familial units, responsibilities, which again, the Dharmic way of life experience. So there's a lot of present context. I think in the present government's context, I think they're making efforts to sort of look at some angles of this, which is welcome. But I think there needs to be a more strategic, more organized approach to this to expand these economies of scale. Because this eventually is the one, in my view, that is going to play an important role as we move towards Viksit Bharat. Because it consists of large sections of the population. Of course, it serves as an addition to the current setup. I think any wholesale change is not possible, neither desirable. But at the margin, it makes a huge difference in terms of effectiveness of policy, because policy making becomes aligned to the way of life, not the other way around. So I think that's a broader, thesis that I try to sort of promote. And in my next book, I provide a lot more details on how some of these things can be done.
I'd like to end up with your example that you just wrote an article for News 18 on the economics of the Kumbh Mela. But before we do that, I just want to, so people can wrap their head around it a little bit. You mentioned, I think, if I've got it, I did not write it down, but we have a couple different versions of capitalism. The Anglo-Saxon one coming out of England, spreading throughout Europe, the Chinese one, and the Dharmic one. If people wanted to sum those up, maybe 2 or 3 points of similarity, contrast, could you do that for people just so they can really wrap their heads around that?
Yeah. I mean, see, the conventional capitalistic model is all for us to see. Which is basically there are 2 main instruments of it, the state and the market. And then it works on this idea of a Protestant ethic, which is basically institutions, the role of institutions, role of the state, and all the debate, discussion are all around it, by and large. Of course, there is literature in the West which talks a lot about identity and things like that, but by and large, this is what the sort of Anglo-Saxon model is. The Chinese model is a bit different. I mean, you have a communist state, but in a sense that at the ground level, there's a lot of democratization that happens in the sense, though democracy is not, there in the country, but at the ground level, in terms of villages, in terms of tier 2, tier 3 cities, they're all governed by groups of, bureaucrats and policymakers who have their own democratic processes to evaluate some of these policies. But an important part of that, the decision making that they use is the idea of a social cultural fabric of that village, of that particular community, and how they can align some of their outcomes to that. So the Chinese try to, inculcate. This is despite the cultural evolution, right? Despite all the, vast of, cultural things that have been, extinguished in China. But despite that, they still look at some of the local elements and try to evaluate policy. So this is I would call an iterative process. The iterative bottom up sort of customized process, empowering the bureaucracy. That's probably one of the elements of this Chinese model in very simple terms. The Japanese are different. The Japanese are, they're they're very overtly culturally driven in the sense it's very, everything around Japan is in Japanese. It's very difficult for you to go inside Japan with English, for example, right? And their local fabric is very, very inbuilt into their system. So much so that even the Ministry of Finance has a ministry of, a subdivision which talks about the role of culture and norms in Japanese society. And it reflects a lot in their choices as well. So they make an effort, they challenge the role of institutions and argue that a lot of Japanese researchers talk about the role of cultural norms and narratives in their decision making. So in Japan, it's the state and the market still exists, but the role of cultural identities plays a very stark role, right? But in either of these cases, I mean, I think where this dharmic model, I would say, stands out is that the idea of dharma is not antithetical to both the state and the market. It is not antithetical to any model. It serves as a very good complementary effect to one model, right? The rule of law and order is a very important component in any society. But beyond the rule of law and order, there's also a cultural narrative that runs in parallel. So the idea of dharma tries to supplement this system. I think in that sense, I think it is a very inclusive addition, and it tries to address a lot of contemporary problems, right? We're talking about climate change, we're talking about sustainability, we're talking all these issues are all intrinsically driven in this model, in my view. So, referring to the Mahakumbh, of course, I mean, if you look at the Mahakumbh, I mean, my piece, as you mentioned in News 18, talks a lot about this. But just to give you some context, right, some numbers just for your audience. We're talking about almost 400 million people who are coming into a tier 2, tier 3 city for 45 days. And, there are hundreds of new railway lines which have been developed. There have been, a plethora of toilets who've been built. The total infrastructure is about 7,000 crores, about 5,000 rupees, 5,000 crores from the state and 2,000 crores from the center. It's estimated to have revenues of almost 2.5 lakh crores. Just to give you some context, the Uttar Pradesh, the state which is hosting the Mahakumbh in Prayagraj, its state GDP for 2023-2024 is 25.8 lakh crores. So even if you assume 2.5 lakh crores to be a higher number, let's say we have a lower estimated 1.5 lakh crores, it is still 5 to 10% of the GDP of that calendar year. And that's a huge impact. And this CII, the main sort of center for Indian industry, estimates about 10 lakh jobs are being created because of this. So what I'm trying to say is the Mahakumbh and events like the Mahakumbh is probably one of the biggest manifestation of this dharmic way of life in a very stark manner. But besides the religious social element, there's a huge economic interface, the infrastructure that has been created, the roads, the airport facilities, the support infrastructure, most of them will remain after the Mahakumbh for that city, for that particular area. So in a sense, what it also does in a very chaotic democracy like Bharat is that it gets the bureaucracy to really work in a time-bound manner, because within 45 days, the entire world is looking at this. So you have to build an infrastructure which is time-bound and deliver. And it helps to get outcomes done. So I think it would be very wise for policymakers to have, because, and one more point further here is that this is what I call highly inelastic demand in very technical economic terms. Because whether the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India's interest rate is at 5%, 10%, whether its inflation is at 10% or 15%. Or if there's even a nation state there, in practice, you would still get millions of people to come to the Mahakumbh, which has been going on for thousands of years. Which means that, the demand in a pure economic sense of all these people coming to this place still remains, which is again when you look at it at an economic angle, it's a very good vantage point, especially if you want to drive economic activity, to use a lot of these levers. So I think these are all new ideas, but new in the sense that new interpretation or new approach to look at these ideas. But the way of life is something that one needs to be cognizant about. And I think more and more policymakers align their policy towards this, more efficient policy making becomes.
Thank you, Sriram. That was very informative and has me thinking about many other things, but we are at about time. To wrap it up, where can people follow you, and where do you have a preferred place where they can buy your book?
Sure, I'm on Twitter at Sriram B 1000, and I'm on LinkedIn and other platforms as well. You can buy my book on Amazon. It's available in Amazon India. Of course, read the book, review the book. Would be glad to get your thoughts. It should come in the US portals soon in Amazon, but there's a Kindle version available already. And of course, if you want to buy it in Walmart, it's still available for a US audience. And I do hope to do some city tours in the US as well in the next couple of months. So look forward to meeting some of you guys in person.
Well, that's it for this episode of That's So Hindu. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it now with someone who you think will like it too. Please also like, follow, and/or subscribe to this show on whatever platform you're listening to it on. You can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at www.hinduamerican.org/donate. Thanks again for listening.